Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Dominion's 5 Strategy. We're having, yes, a special extra video today on request. I do these from time to time. Somebody wants to commission an extra video. I'm happy to do it. I love doing this, and so it's no problem for me. So, in any case, I was requested to do, and commissioned rather, to do an extra video today on Early Age Relay, which is, or Relais, however you'd like to pronounce that. Probably Relais is more accurate. Early Age Relay is one of the, well, it's a nation that has some distinct strengths, but also has one very, very crucial weakness that, in my opinion at least, leaves it as one of the weaker nations in the game. Certainly one of the weaker nations in the era. So let's go through the units and then we'll kind of talk about general strategy. Commander-wise, we have a scout, and he is amphibious, so he can go on water and land equally. We have the Slave Prince, is Relay's only standard commander. Amphibious, 50% dark vision, Taskmaster +1, and is a slave. So he's been enslaved by the Mind Lords, the rulers of Relay. And he is, unlike most Shamblers, this one has not been lobotomized and has standard leadership, pretty beefy magical weapon, high protection. None of those are terribly relevant, to be honest, for what he is. He's just a commander. The relevant characteristics are 80 leadership and Taskmaster +1. However, since he is a slave, he does have very low upkeep, which is nice. We have a Slave Priest. This is a merman, so also amphibious, can go on land, and just a level 1 priest who is a slave, very low morale. That is a common theme in Early Age Relay. Almost all of their units are slaves. The Slave Mage, 175 gold for 4 paths, which is not bad at all. That's only a little over, it's about 45 gold per path, which is very, very solid. Unfortunately, they are old, so they will get diseases and afflictions and die eventually. They are amphibious and slaves, so once again, garbage morale. Now we move into the non-slave commanders. There are 3 variants of the Amulet, which is the standard, how do I put it? The standard, like, main mage/unit of Relay. There's the Amulet, the Abodai, and the Mind Lord. The Amulet, 2 water, 2 astral, and 1 random from water, earth, astral, and death. Very, very good path set. A little bit more emphasis on water than you would need in most above-ground combat, but for fighting in the water, Amulets are fantastic. Only 215 gold for 5 paths. Once again, very efficient. They are magic beings and aquatic, so they cannot go above ground. They have Void Sanity, which isn't terribly relevant in the early era, becomes relevant in the middle and late eras. They have a lot of magic leadership, 150 magic leadership, but only 10 standard leadership, and they are Taskmasters +2, so they give slaves a morale bonus. Plus, they have Spirit Sight, so they can see invisible, and they are not affected by darkness. The Abodai is an Aboleth variant, which is sacred, also has Taskmaster +2, basically the same thing as an Aboleth, but sacred, and starts with a level of death instead of 1 level of water. Same randoms exactly, so Abodai can reach death level 2, which is an important breakpoint. And then you have the Mind Lord. The Mind Lords are slow to recruit, capital only. Abodais are also capital only. So, slow to recruit, capital only, 7 paths. A very, very powerful mage. Fairly powerful even by early age standards. 420 gold, so quite expensive. But high hit points, very high magic resistance, decent morale, high leadership, and 7 magical paths. They're solid. Mind Lords are very, very powerful units. They're not super combatants in the way that many other slow to recruit capital only mages are in the early era, because they don't have slots. They only have 2 miscellaneous slots. But that said, you can actually make it kind of work. You can thug with Mind Lords, because they have this Soul Leech attack, which is AoE 1, so they can suck the life out of 3 infantry at once. And they can enslave minds, and their paths give them a lot of various powers. Especially if they random Earth, they can be quite effective thugs. Your last standard mage is the Androdai. They can only be recruited on land in coastal forts. They're expensive. 190 gold for only 2 paths and 1 priest level, which is a little bit unfortunate. Same randoms as everybody else. In terms of their magic power, Androdai really aren't worth it, especially because they are also insane. So 10% of the time they just ignore what you want. However, there's a special national spell related to Androdai that makes them useful in small quantities, which we'll talk about later. The last 2 commanders for EA Relay are the Grandmother and the Polypal Mother. These are immobile, and they don't have magic. The Grandmother has 1 astral, but realistically they don't have much magic at all. The main use for them is that they are Dominion monster summoners. They spawn polypal spawn every month. So they do spawn free chaff. Now, the problem with this is, A, it's very, very crappy chaff, and B, it's aquatic, so it can't go on land. So once again, you'd just be generating things that are only useful in the water, and frankly, as early age relay, you already have enough underwater power. It's above ground power you need to be worried about. But Grandmothers, they're expensive. I personally would not really ever recruit them, especially because they can't move. They only have miscellaneous slots. They only have Astral 1. They are wholly level 3, so if you can find a way to make one move, you could theoretically teleport one to claim a throne or something, but to be fully honest, in my experiments, I haven't found an easy way to make one move. In fact, I'm not even certain they can teleport. I haven't tried that. I should try that, but I don't think they're worth it. 300 gold and a capital turn for that? I guess technically you can recruit them in any fort, but why would you when you could recruit a mobile mage instead? And then you have the Polypal Mothers. They can only be recruited outside of forts, and they are basically immobile defenders that can spawn Polypal spawn. If you've taken a province that you really, really want to defend or are in the process of building a fort, I suppose you could recruit a couple of Polypal Mothers there if you put up your temple first. They get 2 Mind Blasts per turn, which can be useful in defensive battles, and they will spawn Polypal spawn every turn. So, I mean, that's something. When they die, also, there's a stun effect that hits everyone around them, which can be useful. I don't know. Polypal Mothers, I guess, are kind of borderline if you have spare resources. Grandmothers, I think, are definitely not worth fort turns. So, mage-wise, these 3 mages, the Aboleth, the Abodai, and the Mind Lords, they're all quite powerful and very useful. They have one major problem, which is that they are aquatic, so they can't go above ground. They're also magic beings, which isn't terribly relevant, but the main issue is the aquaticness. They are unable to leave the sea, and it's very, very difficult as early age relay to get them to be able to leave the sea. It's difficult and expensive. So your main recruit, the mage that you use most often, the mage that you lean on as early age relay, will be the Slave Mage. Now, the Slave Mage is actually quite good. 4 paths for 175, so extremely efficient. Very low upkeep because he is a slave. Decent paths. You get nature access, you get earth access, you always have astral and always have water, so you can form Slave Mage communions. They're expensive, but they're solid, they work. The only downside to the Slave Mage is a low morale, but frankly, for combat mages, normally that isn't a huge problem. If your combat mages are being forced to take morale checks, you're already in a precarious situation. So, Slave Mages are definitely going to be what you lean on. Aboleths? You'll want some Aboleths, but not a huge number. Mainly, you will want to be recruiting Mind Lords in your capital, with occasional Abodais. You need some Abodais in order to site search. You need that Death 2 random in order to start up your death economy. Well, you don't need it. There's another way you can get it, but it's handy to have Abodai around to site search and to cast death spells before you get the late game death economy rolling. But mainly you'll want Mind Lords. Mind Lords are your most powerful mages. Like I said, they're usable thugs if you want to use them that way, and they can definitely be centerpiece mages for casting very powerful spells. For example, sometimes they random Astral 4. If a Mind Lord randoms Astral 4, and you give him 16 slaves, then he's Astral 8, and it is trivial at that point to boost him up to cast spells like Master and Slave. So Mind Lords can be extremely potent. You just have to get them above water, because most of the fighting in any given game of Dominions is of course going to be on land, not in the water. In terms of units, there's kind of 2 categories of units. Well, there's 3 categories of units for early age relay. Slaves, magical thralls, and Aboleths. So the magical units, Lobo Guard, are just cheap. That's their defining characteristic, is they are incredibly cheap, and they're mindless. So they have infinite morale. Their magic resistance is garbage. Their stats, generally speaking, are garbage, but they have above average hit points and above average strength. And so the fact that you can recruit 1,000,000 of them for 5 gold a pop and pretty much nothing by way of resources and recruitment points is very impressive. Being mindless makes them immune to a whole bunch of spells. They're amphibious. The only downside is they are magic beings, so they have to be led by somebody with magic leadership. Now, fortunately, the infinite morale means you can give them to slave mages who have magic leadership without caring about the morale penalties that are attached to the fact that they only have leadership 10. So that's an easy way to get Lobo Guard above ground. You send your slave mages to attack a shore province, and every one of them has 20 or 25 Lobo Guard, however many they can support. Your other magical slave is the Shambler Thrall. Likewise, infinite morale, likewise garbage stats, but high hit points, high strength, and a high damage attack. And of course, dark vision, 50%. Lobo Guard actually have dark vision 100%, which can be useful in some circumstances since you have death magic. So these two can just be given to mages and led around by literally anyone. Also, since Amulets have huge magic leadership, one Amulet can lead a very significant army of Lobo Guard and Shambler Thralls to conquer underwater provinces extremely efficiently. Then you have your slaves, which are your actual infantry. There are 3 Atlantean slaves, 2 Merman slaves, and 2 Triton slaves. The Tritons, of course, cannot go above water. The Mermen and the Atlanteans can. They're all slight variations on each other. The most interesting ones are the Merman slave troopers with nets that they can throw to web people up, and the slave guardians with helmets, which have pretty decent protection as well as more or less okay stats, somewhat low, but not bad, and high damage bone tridents. So for my money, if you're recruiting these troops, what you do is you mix slave troopers in with slave guardians of either this flavor or this flavor, the one without hats if you're low on resources, and you web people up, and then you stab them with your bone tridents to do a ton of damage. The Tritons. The Triton slave guardians have higher stats for their cost. You can compare them here like if you compare this slave guardian to the Atlantean, lower hit points, but attack 10, defense 9. Well, I guess actually they're about the same. The Tritons are a lot faster, so these kind of serve as your cavalry. The downside, of course, is that they are aquatic, and so they can't go above ground. And that is, as I've mentioned, the common theme with Early Age Relay is you struggle to go above ground. And then you have your Aboleth units. You have Giboleths, which have Mind Blast and are not sacred. You have Gibodai, which have Mind Blast and are sacred. And you have Androleths. Androleths can only be recruited in coastal forts, and these are your above-ground Mind Blasters. Don't let the spear fool you. They are not good in melee. They're garbage in melee. Don't put them in melee. Just use them for Mind Blasts. Androleths are literally Giboleths, but on land. The only difference is they're more fragile, frankly. So, as Early Age Relay, like I said, your mage is going to be the slave mage. That's what you're going to lean on. These guys are specialists that you recruit in limited numbers, and mainly you're going to focus on mind lords. Mind lords and slave mages, occasionally aboleths and abodai thrown in for specific purposes. Personally, I would recruit abodai until I got a death 2, and then shift over almost entirely to mind lords, since those two are the capital only. Androdai, you're going to recruit infrequently and for specific purposes. And I'll talk about, well, for specific purpose, and I'll talk about what that purpose is in a bit here. Troop-wise, you're going to want a lot of Lobo Guard. You're going to want a lot of Shambler Thralls, because those are the ones that you can easily take up on land. You can also, you can also take the Atlanteans up on land easily, but you need slave princes to do it, or other amphibious commanders, and you need the Taskmaster, really, because, of course, since they're slaves, their morale is garbage. So for your slave troops, personally, I would be recruiting these slave guardians with the higher protection and the slave troopers with nets, primarily. But I would venture to guess, numerically speaking, most of your troops are going to be Lobo Guard, just because you can crap out 1,000,000 at a snap of the fingers and not care about losing them at all. In terms of gem income, you start off with 3 astral, 2 water, and 1 earth, which kind of defines your starting capabilities. You have a lot of astral magic, and that is Early Age Relay's greatest strength, is they have a ton of astral magic available. The main problem for Early Age Relay, and the struggle that you're going to be facing the whole game, and the struggle that makes Early Age Relay not a strong nation, is that you have to get above ground. Most of the fighting in any given game of Dominions happens above ground. There typically are not many thrones in the water. There's typically not many nations in the water. So as Early Age Relay, you can fight very, very effectively in the water. You have lots of water magic, you can summon water elementals, you can cast School of Sharks, Friendly Currents, etc., etc. You can communion up, you can do all sorts of cool stuff. And of course, all of your troops can fight very well in the water, but you have to get out of the water at some point. So the trouble for Early Age Relay comes mainly after you've secured and solidified your position in the water, and now you're looking around and saying to yourself, well, how do I actually win the game? You can only actually win the game by getting out of the water. And that is a real struggle. There's one item that allows an aquatic unit to become amphibious. It is called the Amulet of the Fish, and it requires 1 water and 1 air to construct. Do you see the problem? You don't have any air magic whatsoever. No Relayan mage even has access to air magic. So, in order to get aquatic units out of the water, you have to get air magic somewhere, which leads us to Pretender design. As Early Age Relay, for my money, one of your greatest priorities is to have a mobile god chassis that has a point of air magic. At least 1, more preferably 2. You have access only to the regular underwater chassis. You do also have the Ghost King, which can work sometimes. He's naturally ethereal and has decent hit points. And the Rod of Death, which is armor negating. But, I don't know. I don't really like Ghost Kings. For my money, Early Age Relay, well, there's a couple of different ways you can go. As Early Age Relay, if you're okay with waiting, you can take an immobile with some air magic, and you can rely on Voice of Tiamat to sight search. Now, Voice of Tiamat shows up about midway through the game. It's Conjuration, I think Conjuration 5 or 6. Give me just a second, actually. I need to turn off my, Oh, I already had it turned off. I thought I had nope, I had the debug mod on. So, let's go back into creating a god real quick. Having the debug mod on makes all spells look to be level 0, so you can't actually tell where spells are. So, Voice of Tiamat is a high level, level 5 water sight searching spell. It costs 8 gems. But it shows you all elemental paths in underwater provinces. And since you have decent water gem income right from the get-go and lots of water magic, you can use Voice of Tiamat to sight search underwater if you'd like. And that is guaranteed to find you all air sites. So if you want, you can take an immobile, like a Demi-Lich, or the Polypal Queen, who starts off with 3 paths and 4 Dominion, which is pretty solid, or something like that. I don't know. Void Lurker ain't bad. The Monolith is the classic. You can take one of these things, Dormant, and get a kind of a middling Mage Bless for your Androdai and such. For your Abodai, sorry. Not the Androdai. Nobody cares about the Androdai. But you could take a middling Bless if you really wanted to, although you don't need it as Early Age Relay. Or you could just focus on Scales. And give them a little bit of air magic. And go from there and use Voice of Tiamat to sight search for air. My preference, I clicked the wrong button because I'm dumb. My preference would be to take a mobile chassis with air magic and sight search with it. That becomes expensive, but there are a few chassis where it can potentially work. So in terms of expanders for Early Age Relay, the Worm is a good expander. The Sea Dragon is an acceptable expander. The Father of Monsters is actually an okay expander, because he has an AoE Torch of Unquenchable Fire, which is effectively a firebrand, plus the 2 Crab Claw attacks, so he does quite a bit of damage. If you buff his prot in some way, then he does fine. You may have to wait a couple of turns to forge him a set of some kind of armor, but he'll be perfectly alright. And your expansion underwater is not bad anyway. I probably would not take the first spawn. I don't know. I just don't feel like the first spawn is terribly useful. I mean, he's basically a Mind Lord. But Protection 2 is just agonizing, so I personally would not. If you want an expander, Father of Monsters, Worm, or Sea Dragon. That's kind of what I would stick with. Taking the Grand Hydromancer is not a terrible idea. He generates extra water gems, and he's just a cheap rainbow chassis that you can use to hold a whole bunch of scales and a little bit of magic. And he can get air magic very cheaply. So you could take like 4 air and take like 4 air, 4 water. You could buff your precision. Far Shot doesn't help you. You could get some shock resist or something if you wanted, but you could like take a really minor bless like this. Precision and defense skill, a little bit of cold resistance or something. I mean, it barely matters because you don't really need a bless. Honestly, you could just stick with this and it wouldn't hardly bother you. Take a decent domain. You can tank your heat scales very readily because underwater heat scales barely affect you. And then you can get Magic 3, which is really good for you because you have these mages that are already good researchers, and so that magnifies that. Max out your growth. You don't need productivity as early age relay because you always have access to Lobo Guard, which cost almost no resources, and Shambler Thralls, which cost no resources. Resources are good for these slave guardians, but of the 4 units that you really want to be recruiting, like 3 of them require no resources whatsoever, and then 1 of them requires resources. So I wouldn't worry. I would just take Sloth 3. At that point, I would be tempted to take Luck 3, to be honest. This says your income is still negative, but the game is not accounting for the fact that actually this doesn't hurt you hardly at all because it doesn't affect the temperature scales underwater. So actually your income is slightly positive at this point, and if you want you can take Order to buff it up, or you could spend the points on getting a couple more paths. You could have this guy Sight Search for fire as well, which otherwise you don't have, so now you can pick up some fire gems. And so you'd have the Grand Hydromancer just wandering around sight searching underwater. It's not very risky because, you know, there's likely to be only 1 or maybe 2 other underwater nations, and it's entirely possible that one of them won't even have direct access to you. So you're not in a whole lot of danger. Underwater, your forces are, as I've said, quite frightening. Gibolets and Gibodai are both Mind Blasters, so they can paralyze people. Your troops hit hard, so paralyzed people get stabbed very effectively. You have nets to lock people down, so you have lots and lots of options to lock people in place and let your Slave Guardians, Lobo Guard, and Shambler Thralls beat the crap out of them. Getting above ground, of course, is the tricky bit, and once you've gotten above ground, you lose a lot of options because these 2 units can't come with you, so you have to first build a fort and then mass up Androlets in order to have Mind Blasters above ground. Without Mind Blasters, your army loses some of its punch. You can take the Slave Troopers with the nets above ground, and of course you can take your Lobo Guard and your Shambler Thralls and your Slave Guard. I mean, you can take your units above ground, but without the Mind Blast, their low stats come into play a lot more, and their stats are quite low. Lobo Guard are objectively bad. Shambler Thralls are quite bad. Slave Guardians are at best a little south of mediocre. Your strength is in your magic. You have efficient, relatively cheap magic access for what it is, but your individual mages are not cheap, and they're old, so they will tend to get diseases and die over time. That can be a serious problem for you, especially if you don't yet have any Mind Lords above ground. So, speaking of going above ground, we talked about the Amulet of the Fish, and you really need air magic for the specific purpose of forging Amulets of the Fish. You can also try to buy them from somebody, but quite frankly, if you are selling early age relay Amulets of the Fish, you are making a terrible life decision, and everyone around you will hate you as soon as they find out, because nobody wants these guys above ground. Like, early age relay is a weak nation, and a big part of why they're a weak nation is that nobody will let them get Mind Lords above ground. If you can get Mind Lords above ground, now all of a sudden your options open up really far. However, there is one other way to not exactly get Mind Lords above ground, but get very powerful mages above ground, and that is one of Early Age Relay's national spells, which is, I believe, in Thaumaturgy, Mind Vessel. They have 2 national spells. The first and more important one is Mind Vessel. It costs 15 pearls, and what it does is, you take an Aboleth type commander of some kind, and you basically shove its brain into the mind of an Androdai. Or Androleth, I'm sorry. So the way this works is, you get an Androdai. I was right the first time. I always get them mixed up. You get an Androdai. You take him underwater, because he's amphibious. You take him to a province where you have a lab, and where you have a Mind Lord, or another Aboleth type commander. You could also do it with an Abodai if you had a Death 2 Abodai or something. You cast Mind Vessel, and the Androdai becomes mindless, and gains some of the magical paths of the Aboleth who cast the spell. I believe, I've tested it several times, I believe what it is he gains all the non-water paths. So we can actually go into a test game real quick, so I can show you. So I had a test game right there. This is in debug mode, and so you can see where is my boy gone? I had him down here, I may have moved him. There he is, Batux. So, Batux, I took underwater, I cast, so he is a slave vessel, a mindless creature controlled by the masters. If the master dies, the vessel will also die. But that's not much of a concern. So he's mindless, and you can see he now has 1 earth and 3 astral. We can do it again just to show you how it works. So we're recruiting an Androdai. I am being attacked by the other people here. So I've got Azog. He's got astral and death. He is going to move down. Actually, we're gonna move back to the capital, where we have our various Mind Lords. Alp Arslan already commands a slave vessel, and so that's where the Earth and Astral came from. So we're going to end a couple more turns. So we've gotten back here. Now, Chtogel here is going to cast, this is with the debug mode on. He's going to cast Mind Vessel, requires 3 Astral, on Azog. So Azog is somewhere here in our big ol' list of commanders. There's Azog, so he's got 1 Astral and 1 Death right now. So we cast the spell, and now Azog has 3 Astral and 1 Death. So he gets all the Astral magic of the Mind Lord. That allows you to take powerful Astral Mages up above ground without having to actually send in your... without having to actually get your Mind Lords above ground. So you don't have to forge Amulets of the Fish, and the Mind Lords themselves are not in any danger. Now, it also means you don't get the other qualities of the Mind Lords. It means you don't get level 3 or 4 water magic. It means you don't get thus and such. But at least it means you can have level 3 or level 4 Astral Mages, and you don't have to risk your Mind Lords. That said, it's expensive, and it's a long process. At the very least, you have to recruit the Androdai, move them underwater. Let's say you have a lab next door. Cast the spell, and then move them back. So that's 4 turns. Recruit, move, cast, move. It's involved. It's a pain in the neck. It's not efficient, and it's not cheap. So, there are solutions, but the main problem that Early Age Relay struggles with basically is you have to pay extra just to play the same game that everybody else is playing. Because like in this scenario, I have, Satis on land, me underwater. I can easily conquer all of the water and he can't do anything about it, but there are no thrones underwater. I mean, there's 2 players in this game, there's 3 thrones, and they're all on land. Naturally, on land is where most of Dominions is played. That being so, I have to go into his territory in order to claim any thrones. I don't have the option to stand on the defensive in any way. And I have to pay extra and do extra micromanagement in order to get my guys up on land, and my most powerful mages can't come unless I forge extra special items for them to use. So you see the issue. Now, in terms of magical diversity, there are a couple of summons that are actually really important to you, which are the Naiads and the Kokothiads. Kokothiads get you your late game death economy because they require Water 4, Death 1 to cast, which is very easy for you to get with Mind Lords. And they give you Death 3. So a couple of Kokothiads They're not homesick. They can move around freely. You can give them a skull staff, and now they're death 4. You can use them to do basically all the death magic you could possibly ever want. Eventually, you can ratchet up without too much trouble to summon. I'm losing my words. Summon Wraith Lords, and that will break you into the Immortals. So you can play the Immortals game at the end of the game along with everybody else who's doing that, like the Blood Nations and such. You can't do it quite as well as some of them, but you will have death income because you do have death mages, so it's not terrible. The Abodais will help you there a lot. The Naiads, them being homesick is a pain in the neck, but what you want them for is you want them to summon Fairy Court. Fairy Court. It requires a Nature 5. They have Nature 3. You can get up to Nature 5. And when you cast Fairy Court, which you have to do above ground, you can use them to summon an Air 3, Nature 3 flying Fairy Queen. That gets you air magic. If you didn't already have enough air magic, that will break you in and open up air spells to you. You can potentially forge crystal items in order to get those. Because, you have Earth and Astral crosspaths, so you can forge crystal matrices and slave matrices. So you can break those guys into communions and use them to cast fog warriors and such on your armies, since you will have very large armies of disposable chaff, fog warriors is even better for you than it is for most people. And of course, breaking into air in general is a huge benefit. It's really unfortunate that there are almost no air commander summons. You've got the queens, and that's it. That's literally it. Call of the Winds gives you a hawk, but he's not an air mage. Beyond that, you're just sort of hosed when it comes to air mages. So you're never going to have many. The best you can really hope for is to have a couple that are pretty effective. In terms of other summons, you have Spectral Mages that you can summon with your death magic. They don't actually increase your magical variety any, because you already have all of the paths that Spectral Mages can give you. But at least they give you, Spectral Mages, which are pretty good mage units. And if you're having trouble spending death gems, that's an excellent sync for them. Once you have death, you can also summon undead who can move through the water, long dead horsemen and the like, banes, that kind of thing, and send them up on land so they can help you establish a foothold if you haven't already in the mid-game. So that's the early age relay game. It's very much a matter of trying to work through your weaknesses, because there is this one critical, really, really notable weakness, which is that you can't go on land with most of what you have. And it's notable that this is a weakness that not all underwater nations share, and the ones that don't share it are by far the better ones. For instance, probably soon here I'll talk about Early Age Atlantis. Early Age Atlantis is a much, much more powerful nation, specifically because it doesn't share this weakness. Everything on this roster is amphibious. So they can take all their mages above ground. They can take their basalt kings, their super combatant chassis above ground. All of their troops can go above ground. There's no struggle, there's no angst, there's no forging amulets of the fish, there's no problem. And that makes Atlantis very powerful because, at least acceptably and usably powerful, because it means that, basically, you have a secure base that most nations cannot attack, and you can attack out of it at will. So, yeah, if people work hard, they can keep you trapped underwater, but they can't ever stop you. Relay can be stopped. You can stop Relay just by preventing them from acquiring amulets of the fish, at which point they have to go through this whole long runaround rigmarole with the Androdai in order just to get astral on land. And all you have to fight are slave mages, which are not super powerful. They're okay, they're acceptable mages, they're efficient, they're solid, but they're not super powerful. Good thing about Relay, your research is good, especially if you take Magic 3. Slave mages are giving you 16 research each for 175 gold up front and 70 gold a year. That's great research. You can pump these guys out, and you can achieve really, really high levels of research pretty readily. I keep pressing wrong buttons and backing out when I don't want to do that. For what you should be researching, I would go down thaumaturgy. I would try to hit thaumaturgy pretty early, and conjuration. Conjuration, of course, will open up your water summons, which will get you naiads and will get you Kokothiads, both of which are very useful. It'll also get you Sea Kings, which are amphibious troll mages, which will help. And it will also get you the voice of Apsu and the voice of Tiamat to help you complete your site searching rapidly. It will also, and of course on top of all that, it will get you water power and it will get you water elementals, which are your key to winning underwater battles. So conjuration, thaumaturgy, those are your two big schools. Enslave Sea Trolls is a pretty cool spell. It has the same cost as the Summon Sea Trolls spell, except instead of summoning naked Sea Trolls, it summons Slave Trolls who have armor and glaives. They're the same units with a different name as the Troll Guards that come with Sea King's Court. They're very solid, because, I mean, they wear armor and they have weapons and they regenerate at 25% underwater, or 20% underwater. So they're very, very solid. Yeah, Sea Troll Warriors. It's the same as the guards in the King that come with the Sea Kings. Teleport is also a super important spell for you. If you can manage to get into a pond somewhere, actually, to be honest, you don't even need to get there in the first place. You can just straight up teleport Mind Lords from your capital into other oceans. And if you equip them with Amulets of the Fish, you can teleport them onto land. That can be one way to achieve a foothold on land. If you can scrape together the air gems, you forge 2 or 3 Amulets of the Fish, slap them on Mind Lords, and then teleport those Mind Lords onto a lightly defended province, which you then start building forts and such on, and swarm slaves in to help hold. So that can be pretty solid. You can cast Vengeance of the Dead, which is a pretty cool little ritual that can be very useful to murder thugs, funnily enough. And you can cast Gateway very, very easily. So, if you have a mage who can go on land, you can give that mage a huge pile of troops, cast Gateway, and teleport him and all his troops, all of his Lobo Guard or Shambler Thralls or what have you, from your capital to the coast in one turn. That kind of mobility is very, very powerful. You just have to be sure that you can get there in the first place. And of course, Thaumaturgy is just good for Astral in general. You get Mind Burn, Paralyze, Soul Slay, Enslave Mind. Eventually, you get Master Enslave. And like I said, Early Age Relay is one of those nations that can actually cast Master Enslave really, really easily. And Master Enslave is a super, super powerful spell. It will damage your Mind Lord to cast it, but Mind Lords are so big and have so much HP that it won't come anywhere close to killing them. So, yeah, you can really do some damage by having a communion headed up by some Mind Lords just cast like 4 Master Enslaves at once. That will get you a significant fraction of the enemy army, and that kind of thing causes a ton of damage. So in the very late game, Thaumaturgy 9, I would say, should be your goal, because Master Enslave is just that good. On the way, you can also get Soul Drain, which is kind of a cool spell. Other schools, you do need Construction, obviously. You need to get up to at least Construction 4. Construction 6, less important. You don't have a whole lot of really good thug options. But later on in the game, you can also cast Ether Gate, which gets you Ether Lords. This spell is overpriced for what it does, but Ether Lords are ethereal mages, and Ether Warriors are also ethereal. And they have magical weapons. So, I mean, you have a lot of astral income. Ether Lords and Ether Warriors aren't bad, just expensive. So, since you have a lot of astral income, if you get to the late game, that won't hurt you. Won't hurt you at all. Yeah. That's basically all I have to say about Early Age Relay, to be honest. You will want to go down Alteration at some point to get these high-level astral spells. Astral is going to be your main school. Always. Water is very much supplementary, except for when you're fighting people underwater, in which case water is the big thing and Astral is supplementary. But when you're trying to fight your way onto the land, Astral is your big ticket. You can also do some stuff with Death, but for example, Early Age Relay is not a Skeleспam nation, because the only people who can Skeleспam are their expensive mages, in communions. Early Age Relay is not an Earth nation. They have some supplementary Earth that you can use for buffs, but that's about it. It's water and astral. and primarily in terms of above ground combat, it's going to be astral. But you can throw down all those great astral buffs late in the game, and once again, since you have all of this cheap as crap chaff, Lobo Guard, once you slap down Will of the Fates and Fog Warriors on Lobo Guard, they become intensely annoying for anyone to deal with, because they have infinite morale. And now they have Twist Fate and Mistform. And it becomes just an enormous pain in the neck to try and deal with 400 of these guys. They can wipe out armies just by virtue of stubbornly existing and refusing to die, which is kind of hilarious. Especially when they're backed up by Mind Lords, tossing down big astral spells like they're going out of style. So, hopefully that's somewhat helpful if you're thinking about playing Early Age Relay. I kind of like the Nation. I haven't played them in multiplayer in Dominions 5 yet. They're thematically interesting. That said, the challenges they have to overcome in order to compete on an even keel with most of the other nations in the game are significant. I would certainly rate them quite weak. They're down near the bottom of the nation list. Like the bottom 3 nations in the early age are probably, Yomi, Mikone, and Relay. And that's sad, because they're kind of cool. But with underwater nations especially, it's very, very hard to strike a balanced note where they're neither under or overpowered, just because passing through the water is by itself so binary. Like, either you can get to them or you can't. And if you can't get to them, and they can get to you, then they verge close to being overpowered almost no matter what you do. But yeah, I would like to see some tweaks to this faction, but even as they are, they're very interesting, and they have some very distinct strengths that don't quite, unfortunately, compensate for their very distinct weaknesses. So, hopefully you enjoyed this. Hopefully it was informative to you, and I will see you all in the next video. Thanks very much, and take care.